Hi, Jeremy Cordeaux in the Court of Public Opinion. I'm just on air here to let you know that we'll be live streaming the Court of Public Opinion every Friday between 9 o'clock and 12 on jeremycordeaux.com. Please join us. We'd love to have you.
Dr. Travis Brown, what is This Medical Life all about?
This is the pursuit of knowledge as we learn about diseases from the ancient times to the present day. These are the stories of medicine.
Dr. Travis Brown, I wanted us to record this outside today so that I could get a little bit of vitamin D from the sun that's peeping through the clouds, and you didn't let me.
I wanted good sound quality to have happening going through. But yes, we're revisiting vitamin D, and we did vitamin D episode 25. And that was with Ken Sikaris. And the reason why we're visiting vitamin D is, if I can take us back to a story when I was a registrar, which is a little while ago, but not too far. I was just starting my chemical pathology rotation. And I was sitting there just listening, and vitamin D comes up quite a lot in conferences. It's a little bit, and I didn't know this, a controversial subject. And we had a presentation by a chemical pathologist talking about testing. And at the end, they had questions. And one person who was sort of looked like the old professor that you would expect sat up the back, and then he got up to the microphone and he turned around and he said, "I think everyone is pulling the wool over everyone's eyes here. I'm from a public institution, and I think what is happening here is unconscionable." And it's one of those times where you're expecting nice, pleasant conversations. And I was just like, oh, and this is why I took note of it. And he's looking at it and he's going, this is a contrived deficiency. Vitamin D is not and has been pushed by private pathology for testing and for money making. And you are all making a lot of money from this. And it's not needed, not necessary.
Wow.
And so this was then got into a discussion of, well, what is the utility? What is the usefulness? And when we look at it from an Australian point of view, vitamin D is tested a lot. And it is one of those things that when you dig down into it, you have to sort of say, well, where is the evidence? What's going on? Because from my perspective, I was sitting there going, well, Australians really shouldn't have vitamin D deficiency. We're addicted to the sun. You go past the beach, people still sunbake. It's like, well, how, as just a general population, how are we deficient? Because if you then compare other countries, if we're deficient in Australia...
Oh, God help the rest of them.
And so that's where you start to see. And look, that's why Medicare has so many requirements now for what they will cover for vitamin D deficiency testing. There's a list of like 25 that you have to satisfy as a GP to say, not each one, but if they satisfy this one, it will be covered by Medicare. And things like, people at risk, not a lot of sunlight and everything. And so when we dig down into it, it's one of those things that you look at, common sense logic. Like if we put sunscreen on, well, that technically should probably stop people getting vitamin D because it stops UV. And then if we look at replacing vitamin D, shouldn't that stop the diseases or the complications of vitamin D deficiency? And this is where it changes, because your logic and my logic and common sense, as people keep on talking, can get you into a lot of trouble. And so what we're talking about is your common sense might not be my common sense. And so we need to get to the point in medicine and science where we say, well, what is the evidence? What does the evidence show us? And that's why I wanted to have this, because we have had the discussion from chemistry as to say, here's the levels that we're talking about. So I'd encourage our listeners, jump back, have a quick listen to episode 25 with Ken Sikaris, and then come back and have a listen, because I've got our guest today who looks and examined the evidence, and he presented at a conference, certainly not as controversial as that one.
Yes, yes.
And I invited along to say, please come and discuss the evidence with us, because this is what our latest understanding of vitamin D and what the implications are for our patients, for replacing, and everything we can go from here to see.
Scott Byrne is a Professor of Immunology at the School of Medical Sciences based at the Westmead Institute for Medical Research. As co-director of the Centre for Immunology and Allergy Research and head of the Cellular Photo-immunology group, Professor Byrne and his team are dedicated to understanding the cellular and molecular mechanisms by which sunlight manipulates the immune response. Professor Scott Byrne is our guest today on this Medical Life podcast. Welcome.
Thanks for having me.
As a brief physiological overview, why do we care about vitamin D?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Look, vitamin D it's a general term that we use for really two molecules. One is called cholecalciferol, better known as vitamin D3, and it's probably the most well-known, what we use vitamin D, the term for. And that's sort of the one we're going to really focus on today. That's the one that you'll find in supplements. It's the one that we need in order to have any biological effects. The most important biological effects and why we would care about vitamin D is that it helps regulate calcium concentrations in our blood. Calcium concentrations seem to be very tightly regulated, and it's regulated within very narrow limits. And the hormonal form of vitamin D is really important for maintaining calcium metabolism and phosphate absorption, and that's its main reason why we need vitamin D. And so as a consequence, vitamin D is well known for its effects in helping to maintain bone health and muscular health.
So when we're looking at testing vitamin D, can I ask what is considered vitamin D deficiency?
Yeah, look, there's a few different numbers that get bandied around, but in general, the consensus is that anything less than 50 nanomoles per litre is considered to be vitamin D deficient. So if you're above 50 nanomoles per litre, you'd be considered to have adequate vitamin D levels. But then there's sort of, what we might consider mild, moderate, or severe vitamin D deficiency, and there are various ranges used around the world. But we in Australia tend to use anything less than 12.5 nanomoles per litre of circulating 25-hydroxy D is considered to be severely vitamin D deficient.
Mm. Now, just looking at the recommended exposure for sun levels, what is the recommended level?
That's a really difficult question to answer. And the reason it's difficult to answer is because the amount required varies depending on the type of skin that you have. And, dermatologists, they use, type 1, type 2, type 3, type 4 skin. And they use that, it's called the Fitzpatrick scale. A type 1 skin would burn easily and never tan, whereas type 4 skin would tan very easily. We consider it to be dark skin, high melanin levels. And depending on your skin type dictates how much sunlight you need. It also varies depending on the time of the day. So the middle of the day, you're getting much more UVB radiation, which is what we need to make vitamin D, and the time of the year, whether it's winter or summer. It also varies depending on your geographical location. So if you're living in Tasmania, you're going to have a very different advice compared to people living in far north Queensland. Generally, though, exposure to roughly 15% of the body, so arms and hands equivalent, to about a third of what we call a minimal erythemal dose. That is the minimum amount of UV that is required to cause an erythema. An erythema is reddening, or it's not even a sunburn. It's not even enough to cause a sunburn. It's not what the general population would call a sunburn. And that would be during the middle of the day. And that would result in about 1,000 international units or 25 micrograms of vitamin D. Now, in summer, for most people, that's between 6 and 8 minutes of midday summer sun. And in winter, it's about, so right now, if we went outside, you'd probably need about 16 minutes. In Sydney, at least, where I am, that's what you would need.
So this is how things eke into the popular world. I work from my home office a lot, and I deliberately take my coffee outside to stand in the sun just a little bit. And it's around that amount of exposure. So I'm kind of accidentally getting possibly enough.
It depends, Steve, on the time of the day. So if you're having your morning coffee in winter outside, getting some nice warm sun, you're probably not getting enough.
There you go.
It's in the middle of the day where the sun is at its highest point, and you're getting sort of more UVB type radiation. In the morning and the afternoon, we're mainly getting what's called UVA radiation. UVA is not good at making vitamin D.
Yep.
For those who don't know the difference between A and B, I use the word aging, photoaging. It causes wrinkles, and that's the type of UV you want to avoid. B causes burning. UVB is also the type of UV you don't want because it causes skin cancers and burning. So both types of UV are relatively harmful when it comes to the skin. But UVB is what we need to make vitamin D. So, yeah, look, the reasons why we feel good when we go out in the sun, there's lots of reasons why we feel good when we go out in the sun. The warmth in winter is one reason.
Yes.
But actually, UV does lots of things to the body in addition to making vitamin D. And we can talk about that if that interests you.
Can I ask then, just from a population perspective, we have two kinds of either scientists or pathologists where people talking about no one gets enough vitamin D, and then everything's out the other side saying, no, everyone gets enough, we're testing too much. Can I tell which sort of side of the balance do you come from?
Yeah, look, I think in Australia we are probably, most people are getting enough vitamin D from sunlight. There's also other sources of vitamin D. So there's vitamin D in certain foods. So fish, for example, are very high in vitamin D. And then there are plenty of people who are taking vitamin D supplements on a regular basis, not necessarily because of any medical advice, but maybe because of what they've read on the internet, or they think they might have vitamin D deficiency, or they might have even been tested and been shown to have less than 50 nanomoles per litre of circulating vitamin D. So look, there will be certain sections of the population who probably are severely deficient in vitamin D, and these are people who might cover up their skin for cultural reasons. It might be people who avoid the sun either because they have to for medical reasons. There are certain people, for example, who have genetic diseases which make them allergic to the sun. Allergic is not really the right term, but sort of they react very strongly when they go in the sun. There are people who need to avoid sunlight to avoid skin cancers, and then of course there are people who are living in nursing homes who might also have a need for vitamin D supplementation. So there are certain populations who probably are vitamin D deficient and need to be monitored. But in general, I would say that most people in Australia are probably getting enough sun to make enough vitamin D.
Now, can I ask, there was just a little bit of interest about sunscreen and reducing vitamin D levels. Is that an appropriate response for having sunscreen, that people who use sunscreen regularly will actually reduce vitamin D levels?
Yeah, look, it's a really good question. It was a question that was really, I suppose, addressed really nicely by an Australian study published, 20, 30 years ago now, where they did a randomized blinded control study where they basically gave people either an SPF 17 sunscreen. At that time, SPF 17 was the highest protection you could get. You can get SPF 50 now, 50 plus, and then they gave the other half placebo cream over summer in Australia. And there are 113 people in this trial, so a pretty good trial. And these people were aged 40 and over. And then they took serum samples, measured vitamin D levels, and there was absolutely no difference between the two groups. They both made plenty of vitamin D, whether they were given placebo or sunscreen. And this has been replicated really across the world now, where it's quite clear that regular sunscreen use does not result in lower vitamin D levels. I suppose if you think about it, people who use sunscreen are going out in the sun more. They're putting it on because they're going out in the sun. And so people who tend to use sunscreen also tend to get more sunlight. And so it's perhaps not surprising that vitamin D levels are not affected by sunscreen use.
Do you think they would still stand up with the SPF 50 for those reasons you mentioned? They're actually in the sun more anyway.
Yes, it does stand up against SPF 50.
Right.
I think there's the numbers of SPF 17 or SPF 50 are a little bit misleading. It's actually a log scale, the SPF. So in fact, It's not a doubling in protection. It's less than a doubling in protection from 17 to 50. People feel like they're getting more protected with 50 plus sunscreen versus 17. They're not really. There is only an incremental increase in protection with SPF 50 sunscreen. So no, I don't think it would have any effect of whether it's 50 or 17 plus. So the message really in Australia is use sunscreen. I put sunscreen on, I put it on my kids. It's really important to protect us from getting burnt from the sun, because we know that a sunburning event, particularly in a child, is the biggest determining factor of whether we get melanoma later in life. And we need to be very mindful that sunlight exposure is linked to skin cancers.
Can I ask, I wanted to touch on the area that you're researching about vitamin D and the immune system. Can you tell us a little bit about that area?
Yeah, this is a really fascinating area because I've really been focused mainly on the effects of sunlight on the immune system. And of course, when you're dealing with sunlight, you can't ignore vitamin D because it is one of the things that is produced by exposure to sunlight. In fact, exposure to sunlight is the most efficient way in which we can make vitamin D, much more efficient than what we get from supplementation. But also, and this is really important, getting vitamin D from sunlight still is self-regulating. So you can't overdose on vitamin D from sunlight because at a certain point, the sunlight will start breaking down excess vitamin D in the skin. So that's a really nice way to get our vitamin D. So I've been looking at the effects of sunlight on the immune system, and vitamin D does have effects on the cells of our immune system. So nearly all the immune cells that we look at have receptors for the vitamin D. And what happens when vitamin D binds to its receptor is that it goes into the nucleus. It helps to regulate the transcription of genes, and these genes are responsible for a vast array of different functions. But what we've noticed is that giving vitamin D to immune cells, or giving sunlight to immune cells, makes the immune cells less active. They suppress the activity of those immune cells. And this actually partly explains why sunlight is a great carcinogen. It damages the DNA, but it also suppresses the immune system. And it's why we also think that perhaps we can harness the power of vitamin D or sunlight to suppress the immune system in other ways. To give you an example, dermatologists have been using artificial UV radiation to suppress skin inflammation for a long time. So those who have psoriasis or dermatitis or polymorphic light eruption, which is a very common type of disease over in Europe where they don't get enough sunlight, they use UV radiation and the suppressive effects on the immune system to help patients with these types of diseases. It's called phototherapy, and it's actually been around for well over 100 years, and it's used quite widely in dermatology clinics. So our research is looking at how does UV and vitamin D do this? Because if we can understand the processes by which vitamin D and sunlight have this effect on the immune system, we can replicate those effects, or we might even be able to enhance those effects so people can get the beneficial effects of UV without necessarily having to go out into the sun, and which, of course, increases their risk of skin cancers.
There was some discussion about vitamin D and the association with inflammatory diseases. Can you tell us a little bit more about that as well, please?
Yeah, the inflammatory disease, a lot of people are sort of looking at the ability of vitamin D to be used to treat inflammatory diseases. And the reason we think that is because when we look at people who have inflammatory diseases like psoriasis, diseases like inflammatory bowel disease, or any disease associated with inflammation, and that's pretty much all of the diseases because they're all associated with some form of inflammation. When we look at patients who have these diseases, their circulating levels of vitamin D are low. And so this has led sort of to the hypothesis that vitamin D levels are low in inflammatory diseases. So therefore, if we just boost vitamin D levels, we'll fix the problem. But there's an inherent problem with that hypothesis in that the enzyme that breaks down active vitamin D is increased by inflammation. So it may not necessarily be that vitamin D levels being low are the cause of inflammation. And if that is the case, then boosting vitamin D levels is not going to have the desired effect. What you need to treat first, and this is what many people in the field believe, is you need to treat the inflammation first to help the vitamin D levels actually have their desired effect. So just treating inflammation with vitamin D supplementation to increase vitamin D levels is unlikely to have the desired effect. And there are many studies now showing that that's probably the case.
Well, Scott, we're about to take a very brief pause and come back with some very heavy-duty discussion about vitamin D, but you did lay some bait on a hook before about just some of the general benefits of being out and exposed to UV. Could you give us a little succinct sense of what you meant by that?
Yeah, sure. So this is what we call the latitude gradient effect. And it basically shows that the more sunlight you receive, the the lower the incidence of certain diseases. Now, the link between sunlight exposure and disease is the strongest for multiple sclerosis. And this has been now established for well over 30 years, and some terrific studies done in Australia where they showed that if you were born and bred in Tasmania, you're 6 to 7 times more likely to get multiple sclerosis than if you're born and bred in far north Queensland. This is a fascinating epidemiological observation because what it shows us is that where you live and how much sunlight you receive can dictate the types of diseases that you are at risk of developing. This study doesn't show that there is a direct link between sunlight and MS. Those studies took another 20 or 30 years to be revealed. And we now know that actually the ultraviolet radiation within sunlight is one of the primary risk factors for development of the diseases like multiple sclerosis. There are other links with other diseases. There are links with other autoimmune diseases, particularly type 1 diabetes. There's also links with cardiovascular disease. And although we don't fully understand what the effect of sunlight is on these diseases and how it lowers people's risk factors, we are beginning to unpick the mechanisms involved so that we can harness the power of sunlight safely.
Can I ask, does the risk factor change when they move?
Yeah, that's a terrific question. It depends on when in your life you move. And in fact, it appears that the sunlight that we receive as children is really important for, and even in utero might even have an important role to play in our risk factors later in life. And this is true not just for diseases like multiple sclerosis. When they looked at people who moved from the north of the United Kingdom in Scotland to the south of the United Kingdom, a very small latitude gradient difference compared to Queensland and Tasmania, they did actually take on the risk profile of their new place of residence. But it does have an impact on when you move. So they looked at migrants who came to Australia and those who migrated as children versus those who migrated as early adults. The children who migrated were much more likely to develop skin cancers or melanomas later in life than those who migrated in their late teens and early 20s. So I think we still need to understand this more clearly. We don't know why early exposure to UV is a better predictor of risk versus later, but these are studies that are ongoing.
I'd like to put this in our book to come back to at a later episode. There's much more to dig out there. Let's take a very short breather and come back with Scott Byrne. We're continuing our discussion with Professor Scott Byrne regarding our deep dive into the evidence for vitamin D. Scott, for this part of the episode, the linkage between vitamin D and bone health. It's well known, but what's the evidence of replacement and prevention of fractures?
Yeah, there's a perception within the medical community and a perception within the public that vitamin D and bone health is that link is very strong. The trouble is there has been very little evidence to support this hypothesis. The reason why there has been little evidence is because obtaining that evidence is really, really hard. And it requires enormous amounts of money, and it also requires enormous participant levels. And it was really only in the last few years when a study called the VITAL study came out a few years ago. This involved over 25,000 participants, all of whom were over 50 years old. It was done in the United States mainly, and it was involved half of them were women, about 20% of them were African American. It was a very strongly designed study, and so it was random. It was blinded. It was a 2x2 factorial design. It involved supplementation at what we would call reasonable levels, not excessive, ridiculous levels. Mm-hmm. It involved placebo controls. Mixing, so stopping placebo, giving them vitamin D and swapping them around. So it was a very well designed and controlled study. And so this is what we would class as very strong evidence, depending on what the outcome was. And they looked at a range of conditions, including cancer, cardiovascular disease, falls, cognitive function, migraine, strokes, all sorts of things. You know, when you have this sort of this data set that can be generated by using large numbers of people, you can actually generate some very sophisticated ways of understanding the role of vitamin D in these diseases. And last year in the New England Journal of Medicine, the study was published Merrill LaBouffe was the first author and colleagues. They showed it was a particularly important result that they published, particularly on the risk of fractures and bone health. And essentially, they found that there was no evidence that vitamin D was able to protect from these conditions. So this is, I suppose, the reason why this was very big news at the time was that it sort of almost debunked the idea that vitamin D and bone health are linked. I think it really does require us to drill into the details of this study a little bit more. The headline is that vitamin D supplementation in the general population is probably not necessarily going to prevent fractures or bone health significantly. But it is supported by a number of other important reviews, systematic reviews that have been published before this study. So a systematic review, for those who aren't familiar, is perhaps the highest level of evidence that we have. And it basically looks at a range of studies to determine whether there's any evidence that vitamin D is involved in protection from disease outcomes. So there were two important systematic reviews, both published in the Lancet Diabetes Endocrinology, a very prestigious and well-regarded journal. One was published about 10 years ago now by Altier and colleagues, and they looked at a range of different intervention studies that included over 2,500 patients, looked at concentrations of less than 50 nanomoles per litre, that really important cutoff, and there was no evidence that it improved any outcomes. And then a few years later, Boland and colleagues in the same journal published a similar sort of systematic review. And I'd like to just quote, if I can, from that study, what they concluded. They concluded that vitamin D supplementation does not prevent fractures or falls or have clinically meaningful effects on bone mineral density. There were no differences between the effects of higher and lower doses of vitamin D, and there is little justification to use vitamin D supplements to maintain or improve musculoskeletal health. But a pretty powerful conclusion from a really important study.
Can I ask then, we've got two sides of an equation here, and one's saying, okay, there is a deficiency happening in a population, but then even replacing it may not help. How do we sort of make that make sense?
Yeah, I think this is what I was alluding to when I said we need to drill into the details of some of these studies. Yeah. I think the take-home message for the broad public, for those who are generally considered to be vitamin D sufficient or have adequate levels of vitamin D, there is very little benefit to come from supplementing with vitamin D. But there are a subsection of the population who it may be beneficial to supplement with vitamin D or to basically change their advice around their sunlight exposure patterns. Very carefully balancing, of course, the risks of developing skin cancers in certain populations. So I think if we can balance those risks of the harmful and beneficial effects of sunlight, we might be able to give better advice to people around their exposure to UV in order to get adequate levels of vitamin D supplementation.
Okay, so then looking at that study, they also, I think there was also, they believed it did not improve cognitive function, didn't have cardiovascular effects. Was there more about that came out regarding that? Was that needing drilling in more?
Yeah, so those observations were in previous studies from the VITAL study. So the VITAL study was so enormous in its scope that they were able to publish lots of different papers in lots of different journals. And those findings on cardiovascular disease and cancer and cognitive function were previously published. And so the links between vitamin D supplementation and those diseases is not as strong as what it is for bone health and fractures and musculoskeletal health. So I think what really alerted us to this issue of is vitamin D supplementation worth doing was the evidence that it had very little effect on musculoskeletal or bone health. Which is surprising, right? Because we all think, we need to get vitamin D to maintain bone health. And I think we need to be very careful here because it may be that in certain population groups, we do need to actually supplement vitamin D in order to maintain bone health. And there are subgroups within this large study which may have benefited from vitamin D supplementation. But in general, should we give everyone vitamin D supplementation? I think there's very little evidence to support that now.
I was just going to come back to the MS because there was a study where they did high and low dose for these patients. Was there an outcome for those patients?
Yeah, look, I think the links between vitamin D and disease is the strongest for multiple sclerosis. And the reason for this is because of what are called genome-wide association studies or GWAS studies. These are a large population-based analyses of the genetic risk factors associated with the disease. And when they looked at the genetic risk factors associated with multiple sclerosis, vitamin D pathway genes were very strongly represented. Now, this is actually very strong evidence that the vitamin D pathway is involved in multiple sclerosis. How? We don't still yet understand how or why the vitamin D pathway genes are involved in multiple sclerosis. There are other genes also associated with multiple sclerosis, mainly associated with the immune system. And those two things might actually be linked, vitamin D and the immune system we talked about in an earlier act. So the other piece of evidence that we have that vitamin D might be involved in multiple sclerosis is when we look at people with multiple sclerosis, nearly all of them are deficient in vitamin D. This is perhaps not surprising. We know that inflammation activates the enzyme which breaks down vitamin D. People with multiple sclerosis have inflamed central nervous systems and they have inflamed peripheral nerves as well. And so this might also explain why they're vitamin D. So is the vitamin D deficiency responsible for their multiple sclerosis? This is what this study was really hoping to test by giving high doses of vitamin D to people with multiple sclerosis. So this study was published a few years ago now. It was an Australian-based study. And they used two different levels of vitamin D2, so not the active form of vitamin D3, vitamin D2, and they used high dose and low dose. Now, the reason why they might not have a placebo or not have a no vitamin D control, it's possible that the ethics committee said, look, it wouldn't be ethical to not have a treatment group here. There's a lot of evidence that vitamin D is involved in MS. We need to give a high and a low dose. What the study found was that there was no difference between high and low dose of vitamin D2. And so therefore there was no beneficial effect of giving high doses of vitamin D to people with MS. But actually, when you look at the data very closely, it looked like perhaps those with high dose vitamin D performed worse than those on lower dose vitamin D. So there's really little evidence from that particular study that giving vitamin D2 at least would have any beneficial effect.
Now, can I take it just back to population level and look, is there any difference between sun exposure and solarium use?
Oh, massive differences. Do not go and use solariums. Is the message. They are a class 1 carcinogen. They're banned in Australia. You shouldn't be using solariums. There is the biggest difference is that the dosing, the amount of UVB and UVA radiation you're getting in a solarium is significantly elevated compared to what you get in the sun. It can be very hard to regulate the amount of UV that you get from solariums because they're not designed to cause sunburn. They're designed to, in fact, avoid sunburn in many cases. So when we go out in the sun, we self-regulate our sun exposure in some ways by getting burnt. And we realize we can feel ourselves getting burnt. We're like, okay, we need to cover up. I'm getting too hot. We start feeling a bit sick sometimes too. The differences are really quite strong. So if you are feeling like that should I go and use a solarium? I think the answer to that is no. You should not be using solariums. They're dangerous, and they should and consequently they've been banned in Australia.
Wow! So the UV in a solarium gets past our inbuilt triggers and warning systems, is what you're saying. So it sneaks up on us.
Yeah, it's artificial, and so they use tubes that will emit UV radiation that is not designed to cause burning, and in fact, they're designed to cause tanning. And so this comes back to what I was saying about UVB versus UVA. Yes. UVA causes tanning, and over long periods of time, it causes what we call photoaging, wrinkles, and it basically breaks down the elastin and collagen fibers in the skin, leading to really wrinkly skin. That doesn't cause burning. Most people who are using solariums are using them for the desired effect of getting a tan. The makers of these lamps will remove some of those burning wavelengths so that people can get even more doses of UV. This is why they're considered to be a class 1 carcinogen.
Now, there is some evidence that increased sun exposure reduces cardiovascular disease. Do we know how?
This is really fascinating. This is some work that we did a few years ago, and some others in Perth have done some studies in mice. I should say this is in some animal studies, looking at the ability of UV to have effects that are distant from the skin. We know that UV can have an effect on multiple sclerosis. Multiple sclerosis is an autoimmune disease of the central nervous system. So it's definitely having effects that are distant from the skin. Some people think that might be due to vitamin D. I don't prescribe to the fact that vitamin D from sunlight is responsible for the systemic effects of sunlight exposure, because we know there's a lot of other things that are released from sun after we get exposed to sunlight. For example, the reason we feel good when we go out in the sun is not because of vitamin D. It increases serotonin levels. It also increases dopamine levels in the brain. So that's why we tend to feel good when we go out in the sun. People say, "Oh, I go out in the sun; it makes me feel good." It's like, well, that's probably because you're getting increased dopamine levels and increased availability of serotonin. How does sunlight have these dissonant effects? The short answer is we don't yet know. But the fact that you can expose mice to UV, they can eat more, they can eat high fat food too, and not gain weight really is quite a remarkable observation. It looks like the liver might be involved. The triglycerides are affected by sunlight exposure, but it also looks like vitamin D is not responsible for these cardiovascular effects. Possibly one of the reasons why is also from the release of nitric oxide. So there was some really and this is perhaps the best evidence we have in humans as well. This is some work done by Richard Weller up in the UK. And Richard's done some terrific studies where he's looked at exposing humans to UV radiation. He looks in the skin and he can see the release of nitric oxide from the skin, which affects the blood vessels in the periphery. It basically, it vasodilates and lowers blood pressure. And so we think that one of the reasons why UV might be beneficial in the context of cardiovascular disease is due to this nitric oxide release causing vasodilation, lowering blood pressure by between 5 and 10%, which is quite a remarkable reduction in blood pressure following UV. And this, of course, will have dramatic impacts on cardiovascular disease. But importantly, this does not seem to be related to vitamin D.
The reduction in the blood pressure, 5 or 10%, how sustained is that once you come in from out of the sun?
Yeah, see that's a really important question. It's not sustained. That's the problem. So I think it's transient, and so we need to understand how can we harness those beneficial effects on a sustained level in order to have beneficial effects over the long term. And I think understanding these mechanisms is something that we're busy trying to investigate.
So I'm still trying to work this out. So if we have supplementation but doesn't prevent conditions, what is the utility in measuring or monitoring vitamin D?
Oh, gee whiz, I'm not a pathologist. Jose, why would we want to measure vitamin D levels in circulation? I think if your patients were considered to be high risk, so they're not getting a lot of sunlight, or they might be, for cultural reasons, be using a lot of clothing, you might want to test them to see what their vitamin D levels are like. And then you might be able to recommend, because particularly if increasing sunlight exposure is not an option, you might want to consider supplementation in order to maintain adequate levels of vitamin D. So, look, as I said to you in the first part, vitamin D does have important effects in regulating calcium metabolism and phosphate homeostasis. This is still something that we know that it does biochemically, and so you can't not have vitamin D. That's not negotiable, and so. For most of us, though, we are getting enough sunlight in order to make enough vitamin D. So unless you are suspicious that someone might be severely deficient in vitamin D, I can't see too many reasons why you might want to issue a vitamin D test.
Yeah. So are you using vitamin D almost as a proxy for sun exposure to sort of work that out?
Yeah, and I think this is where many people in my field are heading, that the circulating levels of vitamin D that we measure with the test that the pathologists use is a surrogate for how much sunlight exposure you've had. So I come back to the people with multiple sclerosis. The reason why people with multiple sclerosis might be vitamin D deficient, it could be because they've got inflammation that's breaking vitamin D down, but it also could be that they're not getting enough sunlight. And we know that many people with multiple sclerosis feel that the heat from sunlight can actually cause pain. And so they tend to avoid sunlight. So if you're avoiding sunlight, you're not going to be making a lot of vitamin D. So in those particular patient groups, you might go, well, they're not getting enough sunlight and they've got inflammation that's breaking down vitamin D. Maybe we should be looking at boosting their vitamin D levels to help them maintain their calcium homeostasis. But it may not necessarily have any effect on their inflammatory disease. So you've got to treat the inflammatory disease alongside any low levels of vitamin D that might be there. And that this link of saying low vitamin D is responsible for someone's disease, I think we're moving well away from that now, because we know that boosting vitamin D levels has no impact on those diseases. So why would we boost vitamin D levels? For the other reasons that we've already talked about, but not necessarily to help them with the disease that they're being treated for.
So I think what we're trying to sort of get to eventually is the sun exposure. There is something that's in the sun exposure that vitamin D kind of used as a level, but there's some benefits that we're not actually measuring that's coming from sunlight and sun exposure. There must be something missing that we're missing there.
Yeah, you're spot on. I suppose the take-home message here is that when you get exposed to sunlight, you're getting vitamin D levels, but you're also getting all the other things that sunlight gives us. The increases in serotonin and dopamine levels that make us feel good and perhaps help us feel relaxed and less depressed when we go out in the sun. But you're also getting perhaps the release of nitric oxide that might lower your blood pressure. You're also getting the immune suppressive effects that help to prevent the development of autoimmune diseases or the eruption of inflammatory skin diseases. But, and this is really important, you're also increasing your risk of developing skin cancers. So perhaps putting on some sunscreen when you go outside to play or go outside to work is still a really good idea, particularly in parts of the world like Australia and New Zealand, who have very high levels of ultraviolet B radiation because of the proximity to the hole in the ozone layer that we have to deal with.
Scott, doing This Medical Life with Travis, it's always fascinating, but this episode in particular has been like sitting in the front car of one of those big dippers. It's been absolutely exhilarating. I hope we can talk to you again at some point, but just in closing, any final advice or last thoughts for GPs? Patients come in, maybe they've raised the issue of vitamin D. What would you arm them with? What sort of questions or thoughts would you like to put on the table?
Yeah, look, I can't give medical advice because I'm not a clinician, I'm a scientist, but I would ask them about their exposure habits to sunlight. I think that's a question that perhaps doesn't get asked enough. You know, do you go outside? When you go for a walk, what time of the day do you go out and go for a walk? Try to build a picture of their lifestyle habits that includes what do they do outside, and are they getting, what sort of clothing are they? Are they wearing? Are they fully clothed? Are they fully covered? Are they wearing a t-shirt? Are they going out in the middle of the day? They're going out in the morning to have their coffee, or are they going in the middle of the day to get that level of UV? And you can get a picture of okay, look, they're getting. To me, it sounds like they're getting enough sunlight, so you may not suspect a vitamin D deficiency. And I think they're the questions that I'd be looking to inquire about.
Professor Scott Byrne, thanks for joining This Medical Life.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
This Medical Life is recorded in the Talked About Marketing Studios in Adelaide. For show notes and more information about the podcast, visit thismedicallife.com.au. You can contact the hosts via Twitter. Dr. Travis Brown is at Dr. Travis Brown. That's DR for doctor. And Steve Davis is at Steve Davis. Editing and production is by Tim Whiffen. Design is by Tom Buzenjut. This has been a PathNotes Proprietary Limited production.
Hi, Jeremy Cordeaux in the Court of Public Opinion. I'm just on air here to let you know that we'll be live streaming the Court of Public Opinion every Friday between 9 o'clock and 12 on jeremycordeaux.com. Please join us. We'd love to have you.